Hello, everybody. It is Steve, your friendly neighborhood lawn gnome, and welcome back to another awesome discussion over here on That's Comical. And I am very excited today because it's an original idea that has taken a couple of months until we finally got up and running with this topic and concept. But of course, before we begin, I want to introduce the members of the team that will be joining me today. Of course, Andy is always here for these kinds of discussion videos. Andy, always great to have you. Great to see you.
Hey, Steve, happy to be here. This is a good one. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, and I'm also very excited to have April on this conversation as well. April, great to have you here as well.
I'm super excited to see where this conversation goes.
I'm sure everybody in this room is, especially me, because I am definitely not as knowledgeable about the specific person that we'll be discussing in this entire group. But anyway, I hope you all enjoy this conversation as well. And if you do enjoy it, please don't forget to leave us a like and a comment. I'm sure you'll all want to have some great conversations with us over here on the team. And of course, if you want to see all the stuff that's happening over here on this channel, please do not forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you are up to date with all of our latest content. So just a little bit of a background. This was a concept that Andy and I first started creating when That's Comical was a concept on my own personal YouTube channel. Our conversation piece was going to be something called the Topics 3, where we were going to do a must be read. We were going to do character profiles, but the other thing that we really wanted to do was we wanted to dedicate a few of these discussions to a specific creator in the comic book, and most likely at some point in time manga will join this mix as well, as it should, because this is a comics and manga discussion channel. And it's called Creator's Notes, where we are going to talk about a specific person in the comic industry, whether it's a writer or whether it's an artist, and just talk about some of the things that you should know about this person and why we love this person so much. And the first person that we're going to be talking about is a modern day legend, if you will, in the world of comics as well as some other areas of media. It is Neil Gaiman, and I couldn't have asked for two bigger fans of Neil Gaiman in Andy and April, so I am anticipating this conversation to pretty much be helmed by them once I stop this rambling introduction. So let's just begin with our opening statements. Tell me, we'll start with you, April. Where did you first discover Neil Gaiman, and what was the first thing that you ever got exposed to in terms of any of his work?
So my first Neil Gaiman experience would probably be Mirror Mask. It's one of those kind of off the beaten track kind of movies. I actually saw the movie before I ever read the book, and it just had this like very magical whimsy to it that I absolutely love, especially coming from a fairy tale background myself, that I fell in love with it. It is one of my favorite movies just because of just how bizarre and weird and almost labyrinth-like that it is. So that was my first Neil Gaiman experience. And from there, I just kind of started diving into a lot of his movie work and some of his TV work as well.
Okay, Andy, you are someone who had a Neil Gaiman quote at your wedding. So I am very curious to know about where your adventures with Neil Gaiman actually began.
The first time I was exposed to Neil Gaiman was during the kind of Renaissance period of me rediscovering comics when I was early on in college. So it was my freshman year of college, and I was looking into comics. And after going through kind of, a couple current things that were going on and some back issues and famous stories of really character specific things I had been looking at, I think I said in previous episodes, that's around the time that I read Hush, Long Halloween, Arkham Asylum, and was going down that Batman rabbit hole. I then started to just look into creators who I had missed and didn't know much about. And consistently what I was seeing on lists of greatest comics of all time was the Sandman series. So I read volume 1 of the trade paperback releases of Sandman at that time. And even though amongst fans, volume 1 is thought of as kind of lesser in the story, like he was still kind of finding his legs and figuring out what Sandman was going to be, I still really enjoyed it, especially the last issue that they put into that volume, which was done very intentionally to let people know this is kind of the tone where we might be going with this. So that was really my first exposure to Neil Gaiman.
Well, I gotta say, I thought that we were all going to have somewhat of a unique story, but apparently it's not going to be that way. But actually, I read Neil Gaiman's work and didn't even know it when I was a little kid, because I, for the longest of times, especially when I cracked open my comic book collection before it officially took over my walk-in closet in my basement. Andy knows this very well, as he has joined me on looking at these collections many, many times. I own a copy of Spawn issue number 9, which was the first appearance of the character Angela, and I did not even know that Neil Gaiman, not only did he create Angela, he wrote that book. And so when I really got back into comic collecting back in 2019, and I was going through my comic collection, and of course I was looking at all my old books, and I was looking at my Spawn number 9. I was like, oh, I love this book. You know, I have the first 10 issues of Spawn, and I'm just looking through the pages. I'm like, wait a minute, Neil Gaiman wrote this book? How did I not know this? Like, nobody told me this. I also had no idea that Neil Gaiman even set a lawsuit out on Todd McFarlane and Image Comics because he took the rights of Angela away from Image Comics. I did not know that. But the first time I actually got exposed to Neil Gaiman knowingly was Mirror Mask. And why was that the case? Well, I'm a Jim Henson fanatic. I think that Jim Henson was one of the most creative minds that the world has ever known. And if people out there disagree, come at me and fight me on that. But I saw the trailer for Mirror Mask on a video. I can't even remember what movie it was. The trailer was even attached to on the VHS or DVD. I can't even remember that either. But all I know is that I'm looking at this trailer for Mirror Mask, and I'm like, what in God's name is this? This looks so cool and so trippy. I'm like, I gotta watch this movie. And I heard Neil Gaiman's name, and I'm like, okay, whatever this person is, whoever this person is, I don't care. I want to watch this movie. And April, yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but Mirror Mask is definitely unlike any movie out there right now. And after that, I feel a little bit sad about myself because I really have not read that much or watched that much of Neil Gaiman's work, and I praise the man for who he is. And that's another reason why I'm glad I have you both here, because I need to know a little bit more about other things that he has done. So that was my first exposure. So I guess we'll now just talk about some of the works that we all truly appreciate about him, and we'll just get a little bit more of an insight, and hopefully we'll educate each other, because one of the things that I personally want to know, and April can definitely understand this, is as members of the BookTube community, to a certain degree, a Neil Gaiman book specifically has been mentioned by many, many booktubers. It's The Ocean at the End of the Lane, and I definitely need to know a little bit more about that book, because people talk about it, but then they don't really say much that like makes me want to actually pick the book up and read it. I know I should, but I have not yet. So Andy, I want you to start just gushing your heart out on these things. I personally need to know more about Sandman, because Sandman is a name in comics that comic book fans know, but not everybody has read. And now that there is a television series in the works, I just need to get an understanding of this world. And April, I'm sure you will be able to help as well, because I know that you know somewhat Sandman as well, and I believe that Lock and Key is connected to it in a certain degree as well. So that's another thing I need to know about. But Andy, start off and let this conversation go.
Sure. So I'll just kind of start off talking a little bit about Sandman. So to pick up on the key thing you were saying there, Steve, selling someone on Sandman who doesn't know it and giving you a little background on it. I think it's really easy to do. Neil Gaiman is my favorite author, and Sandman is his masterpiece, I think. I think that to a certain extent, and I don't want to say this is a rule or needs to be the case, I think maybe we'll phrase it as a lot of authors, you can pick up common themes between their works. Not that that means they're limited to a certain thing or that they can only write about one topic. But I think that Neil Gaiman is an author that when you look at his collective work as a whole, there's a couple similar themes you can pick up on. And the main one, which almost sounds silly about an author, but there's really substance here, is storytelling and the nature of stories. And the reason that I say I consider Sandman Neil Gaiman's masterpiece is through the character Morpheus, aka Dream, aka all the different names that he's given by the different cultures explored in Sandman. He's really using this lens of a personification of storytelling and the meaning behind the stories we tell and why. And there's a theme in Neil Gaiman's work about the experience of sharing stories and what that means to be human, to tell and participate in the telling of stories. And I think Sandman accomplishes that the best of all of his work. And I think that's a theme that comes up time and time again. And so because Sandman I see as the realization of that theme when it's so prevalent in his work, it's why I think it's the best. I think that he uses Sandman to explore so much because he gives himself freedom in its design because of the fact that Morpheus is the master of stories, that he's the Lord of Dreams. It gives him the freedom to tell anything he wants. I started by saying that volume 1, the fandom kind of thinks, oh, this is okay, he was finding his legs. It's very much got like a horror theme to it in volume 1. And while there continue to be horror elements throughout Sandman, it is not a horror story in the way that certain issues of the first volume are. It's really, it transcends genre. It explores a lot of different genres. His Midsummer Night's Dream was the first comic to win the Short Story Award. And I just think if I were telling someone to read a single work of Neil Gaiman's to let them know who the author is, I would point them to Sandman. And since it's mammoth and a comic series, I would point them specifically to issue 50 Ramadan, which I could do an entire episode just talking about that issue, so I won't. But without rhapsodizing too much, and I know it's coming across that I like the man because I do. He's genuinely my favorite author. I'm making no intention to hide that. That is what I love so much about Sandman. I think it personifies what he wants to do perfectly. I think it does it in a beautiful way. And I think you get something new from it every time you go to it. I think it's just a completely beautiful work and one of my favorite things I've ever consumed by any artist of any medium ever.
Yeah, no, I would definitely have to agree that the Neil Gaiman is in the business of telling stories about storytelling, because you can definitely see it in Stardust, you can see it in Coraline, you can see it in Mirror Mask, you can see it at Ocean at the End of the Lane, because he has a way of taking myths and legends and old world fairy tales and kind of reinterpreting how we tell those tales and what that means for the audience, which is why I initially fell in love with Mirror Mask, because it's that story about that girl who is telling her own story. And in the process of trying to tell her own story, she starts to read more into her story and what her story really is and the ending of that story. And just seeing that pattern and the way he does his storytelling. And while I agree Sandman is very good work by him, I think it caters to a very specific audience. I haven't read a lot of his other comic work. I've only read Sandman by him. It is very meaty. It is dark in places, and it delves into realms that, if that's not the kind of reading you like to do, can be very uncomfortable, which I think is why I like some of his storytelling that is geared more towards that fairy tale realm, like Stardust and like Coraline, that has a little bit of that innocence kind of interwoven that Sandman kind of touches on, but it goes a lot more into that darker realm of all of that. So for me, if I'm ever telling someone, if you want to be introduced to Neil Gaiman, it's either by Stardust, which is a very easy entrance into Neil Gaiman. But if you want to get more of his his Tim Burton, his Jim Henson style stuff. It's Mirror Mask, it's Coraline. And then with the way they just did Good Omen, I think how they brought it to screen is absolutely phenomenal, because the book is phenomenal too, because I laughed through the whole thing with the very dry humor that Neil Gaiman does throw into a lot of his characters, and it's great. And the characters the actors they chose for those characters were just perfect. But I am also a David Tennant fan, so that sways my opinion just a little bit.
Okay, I have to say this is where I get very angry at myself, because I completely forgot that Neil Gaiman is also attached to Stardust and Coraline, and I have actually seen both of those films. I honestly thought that I personally thought that they were okay. I didn't think that they were fantastic compared to some of the other animation stuff that I saw, although I will say that the animation via stop motion for Coraline was such a good choice. And as someone who believes that there is so many in Hollywood and just in general that are basically like in protest to prevent stop motion from dying, particularly the animation film studio Leica, which is responsible for some of the most creative and most beautiful stop motion animated films in the last 20 years, Coraline being one of them. I am such a big fan of Kubo and the Two Strings, and also I thank Wes Anderson for making such an adorably bizarre film in Isle of Dogs, which is a movie I will always praise. But I completely forgot that those two pieces of entertainment were part of Neil Gaiman, and I will say the best part about the Stardust movie is Robert De Niro. You will never see Robert De Niro in a role like that in any other movie, and I have seen him take on a more lighthearted role in movies like Meet the Parents and Analyze This, but Stardust was just something truly special for that actor. Now, I also have to say that the creation of Angela for Spawn was definitely a cool idea, because what I loved so much about Angela was the fact that we get the story of Spawn, this being from hell that is trying to break away from the bonds and still trying to figure out who he is while he's trying to find his wife, because he wants her to know that he is actually watching her and wants to take care of her and still wants to be with her. But then, even though we know that hell is a cruel place in the world of Spawn, we are then introduced to heaven through Angela, and it's not as pretty as you think that heaven's supposed to be. These angels are just as bloodthirsty killers as the Hellspawn. So the fact that you see these characters like Angela and they're just as devious and just as violent, you just get blown away by that story. And I really think that's the reason why Spawn, even today, with going on 320 issues and now opening up the Spawn universe, that's what keeps these fans on board, because of these worlds and these characters that have been built. I wish that the battle between Todd McFarlane and Neil Gaiman didn't actually happen, because I believe that there were so many more stories to tell about Angela, because we got her origin story later on in the issues of 60s of Spawn, as well as Curse of Spawn 9, and after that, she's just officially gone, and it's really, really sad, because this was a great character. Mirror Mask, I don't know how I can even describe that movie to anyone who's never heard of it. All I say is please watch this damn movie, because you will never see anything like it. The visual effects are so unique. The story definitely gives off an Alice in Wonderland kind of vibe, though it is twice, if not 4 times as trippy as Alice in Wonderland is. And the story is just very heartfelt, though I will say that I will never hear a more disturbing version of the Carpenters' close to you, that is one of the most bizarre scenes I've ever seen in movie history, and it is still ingrained in my brain to this very day, and I haven't watched Mirror Mask in about 6 years. I need to watch it again, because, Andy, I don't know if you've even seen Mirror Mask. Have you?
No, I haven't. And I should actually say at this point that I haven't seen a lot of adaptations of Neil Gaiman's work. I've mostly read the source material with a couple exceptions. So I've seen Stardust. I openly, I do not like Stardust, probably because I had too many expectations going into it, wanting it to, and I hate being that person because I love letting an adaptation do its thing and go its own way. But I think I was a little too weighed down by my expectations of the book, to the point where I recommend to people who are interested in Stardust that they please take the time to read it before they see it, so that it's colored in that direction as opposed to the other. It's not a big deal, but nevertheless, that's something to mention. But adaptations, I've read American Gods, but not seen the show.
Yeah.
I've read Good Omens, but not seen the show. So yeah, so adaptation of Neil Gaiman, I'm not as familiar with, though I have seen Coraline. Unlike Stardust, I don't have as many problems with the Coraline film, but I do kind of prefer the original book to it, though it's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Yeah, and something I wanted to say, pick up on, just to like make sure I'm keying off of something you're saying, Steve. I don't know your experience with Good Omens, if you've read it or watched the series, but if you are interested in Neil Gaiman's take on an imperfect heaven and a redeemable hell, there is another story he's got out there for you. It's a different tone than Spawn, but he explores a lot of the themes that you were touching on there. So I will recommend that if you're not familiar, but if you are, whoo!
Well, just so you know, yes, I have read Good Omens.
Woo!
And yes, I have actually seen the Amazon Prime television show.
Oh.
Now, I will be honest, I do enjoy them both in very different ways, though I will say there is one big problem that I personally have, and it's not with the story in particular. I have a very tough time with British humor in the pages of books. Case in point, and this is a fun fact about me, and I hate myself for it, I never finished A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I only got through the first 2 books entirely, and by the time I got to book number 3 and got a couple pages in, I'm like, okay, I need to take something to read this because I don't understand what the F is going on in this story. So, and that's the thing, I'm a British humor fan. I love British humor. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I was actually thinking about bringing to the table was a statement that a friend of my sister once said. They were going to a British comedy film festival, and my sister is not as big of a British humor fan. Now, I would not be surprised if she enjoyed it because British humor is very dry. And in American television, there is nobody drier than Brian Griffin on Family Guy. And he's one of my favorite animated characters. I love him on that show. So her friend gave a perfect example of how to describe British humor compared to American humor. American humor is as such. Man is walking down the street. Man doesn't see a manhole opened. Man falls into the manhole. That's American. British comedy. Man is walking down the street. Man doesn't notice there's an uncovered manhole. At the very last second, the man notices it and steps to the side, gets hit by a bus. That's British comedy, and that is absolutely true. But I just I couldn't piece certain parts of the story together while I was reading the story. I was having a good time with it. And of course, when I put it down, I said, okay, I definitely want to watch the show. And yes, it's Michael Sheen and David Tennant.
There it is. Okay.
Yes. Michael Sheen plays Aziraphale and David Tennant plays Crowley. And that show was just fun. It was a small amount of episodes, so it's easy to binge, but you're absolutely right, Andy. It's a great depiction of heaven and hell acting badly. That's exactly what it is. Now, it's also really sad that Terry Pratchett was not alive to see this finished product, but the fact that Neil Gaiman was a major force of turning this book into a film, you knew, even though there were going to be a couple of changes made for cinematic value, you knew that it was going to be done with respect to the source material. And yes, it is very entertaining. Now, I've heard in the rumor mill that they're planning to make a second season. I don't know what's going to be the premise, but I said to my wife, because she was the one that told me about it, I said, look, if Neil Gaiman's on board, it's going to be good. So don't worry about it. You know, it's not going to be like Game of Thrones in those last couple of seasons when they ran out of source material and had to basically do things on their own.
No, I can understand not getting British humor. I grew up on it. My dad, we were BBC watchers. I grew up on Doctor Who, which Neil Gaiman has several Doctor Who episodes, which I love.
Makes sense. That makes sense. I didn't even know that. That makes tons of sense to me.
I was actually just watching one of them in the car on the way home before this episode. So it's fresh in my brain. But I also have to agree, the written source material is by far always my favorite. It's just the visuals of a lot of the movies and the TV shows that just really get me, because I do love Tim Burton, because I do love the style that Mirror Mask is done in. It's just, it's one of those things that I really, 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 really like seeing those visuals.
Yeah, and I'm glad to hear that there's another person who just adores Tim Burton. Tim Burton is one of my favorite directors, though I still feel that he's sort of fallen from grace just a little bit because we haven't gotten one of those truly great Tim Burton films that we used to get way back in the... I think the last truly great Tim Burton film that we got was probably Sweeney Todd. That's a very, very good movie. I love that movie. I need to know more about The Ocean at the End of the Lane, because this is the name of a book that I keep hearing and I still don't know what to think about it. So, April, I would be absolutely distraught to say I have no idea if you read it, because I can't even remember you talking about it on one of your episodes. So I am going to guess, as a Neil Gaiman fanatic, you have read it.
Yeah, it was years ago. So it's not one of those stories of his that is at the forefront of my mind. But my gut instinct is, if you really like Mirror Mask in the way that you've got your female protagonist kind of self-discovery through these kind of stories and things like that, you will like Ocean at the End of the Lane, just because of the very nature of both those two stories are very similar.
That's good to know. I mean, again, I want to talk more a little bit about Mirror Mask. I mean, I'm just so glad that the Jim Henson Company took that project on, because, to be honest with you, I don't know any other studio that would have. And on top of that, I wouldn't even know if any of those other studios would have done it correctly, because, again, I haven't read the source material, but I'm going to guess that the source material is just phenomenal based on that movie alone. I mean, you know, when you take a look at the Jim Henson Company and you take a look at the work that they've done outside of Sesame Street and the Muppets and Fraggle Rock, not to say that any of that is bad, all of that stuff is beautifully done. I love everything about the world of the Muppets. But you know, when you take a look at some of those movies like Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, and you can even throw the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie into that, and also one of his short-lived shows, The Storyteller, you know, there's just something about Jim Henson and Neil Gaiman that just is a match made in heaven. And again, it makes me wish that Jim Henson was still alive, because I feel that if Jim Henson was still alive, he and Neil Gaiman would have probably done like 50 projects by now, because those two minds just meshed beautifully together. in Mirror Mask, even though Jim Henson himself was not attached to it. But the fact that it was Jim Henson's widow who said, there's something about this story that needs to be brought to the big screen, and we're going to do it. I'm grateful. I am totally grateful for the Jim Henson Company doing that, and still very angry at Netflix because of the fact that we did not get a second season of Dark Crystal Age of Resistance, because that is one of the most beautifully done television shows that I've seen in a long time.
I think what's great about the Jim Henson Company, now again, this is someone who's not seen Mirror Mask, but now I'm just speaking as a fan of Neil Gaiman and Jim Henson. I think that what you're able to pick up on in Mirror Mask, and we were just speaking about Ocean at the End of the Lane, it's making me think about another one of the big themes in his work, which is that kind of world beneath the surface. I know we've also been talking about Coraline, which is more of like a different place. Neverwhere is going through my mind right now too. But you know, I was talking before about if there's a theme, Sandman exploring it, the storytelling. I think equally important, if you want to do a secondary one, there is Neil Gaiman's exploration of that which is just below the surface, a world of its own. That's just as important as what our day-to-day is. And I think the stories we've been focusing on so far are really, really good explorations of that. So that's just something to bring up about Neil Gaiman. And I think part of what's making me most interested about the Jim Henson Company's involvement is that ability to bring magic and life to the art direction of things is something that really works with Neil Gaiman's work, because it needs to have a true breathing magic to it. And like my lens here is Coraline, right? And so while saying that I'm not as big of a fan as the film as I am of the original book, I think that it really was realized perfectly. And I think that the visuals accurately do the job of showing the transportation and showing that other world. So that's just something that I wanted to make sure I brought up, because it seems like those stories we're pointing to, that's like the theme that I think about there primarily.
Yeah, a funny thing actually came up in conversation. I like that you talked about like the worlds beneath the surface. Just the other day, I was having a conversation with my wife at dinner, and she was talking to me a little bit about Harry Potter stuff, and like, you know, that's the greatest thing in this world. I was like, or in an alternate dimension. So she goes, "What are you talking about?" I'm like, "Harry Potter's world is not part of our world." And she's like, "Well, how do you know?" because it's the world beneath the surface, you know? So I just thought that was a little something cute to mention. But I think another great creative mind in this world, and I could definitely tell, I mean, I wouldn't be, if I'm wrong, I would be shocked. But if there's any other creative mind in entertainment that probably has taken a lot from Neil Gaiman and Jim Henson, is probably also Guillermo del Toro, because you think about these types of people and you think about the types of projects that they have. I mean, right now, one of my favorite things that Guillermo del Toro has given me is the Tales of Arcadia animated series on Netflix. Troll Hunters, Three Below, and Wizards, another world beneath the surface story, if you will. And what I loved so much about it was it just seemed so fresh, especially in a world where I feel that cartoons these days are so stale and repetitive. Like everything seems to be exactly the same. And this just felt like something totally new, along with classic Saturday morning cartoon vibes. And I loved that about Guillermo del Toro's work. I always say that not every movie needs to be redone or rebooted, but I do also say that sometimes a movie that came out that could definitely use a nice little brushing up because of the visual effects being so primitive, I always say that they could only remake The Never-Ending Story if Guillermo del Toro directed it and Neil Gaiman wrote the script. So that's the only way that movie could be done. But
they are friends, by the way. I don't know if you're aware of that, but they are friends.
So we can make this happen.
Yeah.
We should, because another Guillermo del Toro's work that I liked, I went to see that movie that he produced, Don't Be Afraid of the Dark. So I read the book Blackwell's Guide to Dangerous Fairies. That was something different. I loved that book. I wish I owned it. I borrowed it from a friend, and now it's like so hard to find. But wow, that was creepy in a good way. I loved that story. I was like, wow, if Neil Gaiman writes like this, I should read more more of Neil Gaiman stuff because this feels like it's something that Neil Gaiman would write too. So that makes a lot of sense, Andy. It really does.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they have formally collaborated on anything. My understanding is uncredited, Neil Gaiman did a review of the Hellboy 2 script and added a lot of the life to it. But they were going to work on, this is all rumors, they were going to work on a Doctor Strange project together that didn't get off the ground. I don't think he was involved he being Neil Gaiman in this sentence, I don't think he was involved in the Mountains of Madness, thing that continuously is talked about but never actually gets off the ground. But look, the two of them are friends, so fingers crossed, some sort of formal collaboration, something like this is not an impossibility, to say.
Yeah, I'm surprised it hasn't happened yet. That's a shock now that you're telling me this little fun fact. I don't know. Lock and Key, that's another thing that I keep hearing a lot about, especially because I picked up that one comic book that's going to end up having a second part in September, and I really didn't get into it. I mean, I don't know much about Lock and Key either. I mean, someone once suggested to me to watch the show on Netflix, and maybe I should, but what about the both of you? Do you both know anything about this story or this series at all? Because I do not.
Yeah, I read Lock and Key last year. I kind of just like binged through the whole set. And I haven't read the two of them meeting up yet, but given what I know of Lock and Key and the story of these children and these keys and how they interact with the world and how we were just talking about that world beneath the surface that Neil Gaiman does, Lock and Key plays with that, but in a horror aspect. And so those two meeting up, since Sandman has these darker aspects to it as well, I can see how those two would marry. But it would be interesting to see how that takes off. I just actually need to pick it up.
You know what I find very interesting, based on the conversation that we've been having, there also seems to be another very interesting trend in regards to Neil Gaiman, and that's the fact that Neil Gaiman is definitely someone who does write for a mature audience, but he really seems to create worlds that really involve the fairy tale and the child, and the fact that there's even, you see, I appreciate a creator, whether it's a screenwriter or a director or an animator or a comic book writer or a manga writer, that is able to transition from a mature setting to a family-friendly setting. And sometimes you can even be surprised. I think that one of the biggest surprises of my life as a film buff was when Martin Scorsese directed Hugo. Like, you're talking about a man who has done movies about mob culture and corrupt policing and all that stuff, and then he makes a film for families. I find that amazing. And then you take a look at someone like Guillermo del Toro, who can make movies like Hellboy and make an Academy Award-winning movie like Shape of Water. But then he can go and make a cartoon series that children can enjoy and is safe for children, but adults can sit and watch with their children and enjoy it just as much. I find that to be what makes a masterful creative mind. Someone who is able to reach both ends of the spectrum is an amazing feat, and it's starting to become a little bit more common, but I still think it's somewhat of a rarity.
Yeah, Neil Gaiman, he does have incredible children's literature. It's some of his strongest work is intended for children, and it comes across in that love of the fairy tale and playing with the fairy tale structure, not just using the symbols that we think of as being tied up in fairy tale, but really kind of relying on the form of the medium to do it. So my example here is the Graveyard Book. And I think it really perfectly kind of encapsulates what you're saying, Steve, because it is intentionally written for children, and it truly is a children's book. You can read this, it's simple language, it's accessible to children. It does carry that darkness that's in, the rest of Neil Gaiman's work. Was the opening sentence, there was a hand in the dark and it held a knife. There's not a lot of books aimed at 12-year-olds and under in some cases that starts that way. But no, the intention of creating stories that are accessible for everyone does come across in a lot of the stuff Neil Gaiman does. While I wouldn't recommend Sandman to a child, his like whimsy and his love of fairy tale comes across. I mean, in Coraline, that's the quote that's always misattributed to Neil Gaiman is fairy tales are more than true. Not that they tell us that dragons exist, but that they can be slain. Right? That's not a Neil Gaiman quote, but it's at the beginning of Coraline. It always gets misattributed to him, which was also the name of the course that I taught on Neil Gaiman. But yeah, he loves directing magical works to children in an accessible way, and you can tell from the way that he writes about his love of magic and magical realism that it's a natural fit for him. And it really is wonderful to get him to see him play in both worlds, and to see the same themes come across is it's breathtaking.
Yeah, and I think that's why at the beginning when we were talking about what we would recommend to people, and I was talking about two different audiences, Coraline and Stardust being these are what you should go pick up and read first if you want an easier entrance, that more innocent entrance. But I don't know if, Andy, you have read Sleeper and the Spindle.
I haven't.
It is a gorgeous, gorgeous children's book by Neil Gaiman. I have it upstairs. It's one of my favorite. I will be reading it to any child who enters my life, but it's still geared more towards that like darker fairy tale telling style, even in the artwork, even in the plot of the story. It's kind of this reimagining of Sleeping Beauty and what that fairy tale may actually be trying to say, or what it could be saying. And yes, you need to read it.
And that makes so much sense to hear you say, because, I mean, fairy tales are dark things, right? And so they originally designed for an audience of children, moralizing and all of that part to it too. But it's such a natural fit when you think of it that way. You're exactly right. It's a darkness, it's an accessible darkness, but it's one that he crafts language that, I don't want to keep using the word accessible because it's not that, but it's one that a child can relate to. And it's a darkness that still works when adults read these stories. It's a deep-seated one. It's a very natural one. It's something that he can get out that's relatable. And so I completely on board with everything you're saying, and adding something to my reading list with priorities.
And Andy, I'm really glad that you said that, because that was something that literally just popped into my head. I don't think this is going to be an extremely long conversation, but you're absolutely right. People keep forgetting that when it comes to the fairy tale, unfortunately, in the world that we're living in today, the fairy tale has become Disneyfied. Not to say that the Disney takes on fairy tales are bad. I mean, they're some of the greatest animated films ever made, even though some of those movies do have some very, very dark moments. But we have to remember that when the Grimm fairy tales were written, it was about teaching the kids morals, or else very bad things can happen. And they did not hold back on focusing on just how bad some of those things could be. I mean, I've never read the original Grimm fairy tales, but my wife has told me about the original Sleeping Beauty and the original Cinderella, and I'm like, and these are kids' fairy tales? Like, I did not know this, because every time I had a fairy tale, it was presented to me in the form of a Disney movie or a Little Golden Book. So these are things that I didn't even know, and I'm glad that we have people like Neil Gaiman and Guillermo del Toro and others who are actually bringing the fairy tales back to those darker tones, which is pretty much where their origins have been.
And full of love too. I just want to point out real quick, it's not just the darkness that's gripping about. I mean, the Graveyard book really, really shines a light on the humanity of its characters, which is kind of funny to say considering almost all of them are dead. But while it is a dark book that an adult can read and enjoy and truly pick up on a lot of things that a child wouldn't at first blush, it's a relatable story and easy to get into. But the thing I want to go back to is, unlike Sandman, which I'm kind of glad I started there, because April, you're so completely right that it's maybe not the best entry point for everyone. But Neil Gaiman really does have these things that really do work for everyone. And I think it's the care that he has for his characters and the positivity that comes across, even in the stuff that's very dark, like the Graveyard Book. It's an uplifting story. I just think there's something very positive and needed about that.
Yeah, he just has such a diverse way of telling stories and being able to kind of wiggle between audiences that makes him truly captivating.
Yeah, and the truth of the matter is, even though I haven't read a Sandman comic, when I'm taking a look at the trends in regards to what I'm reading now, it's like most of the stories that I am currently reading are horror themed. And, if Cammie was in the room, she would remind me that, you are a much bigger horror fan than you think you are, because you are just not realizing how much horror you are actually enjoying and appreciating, even though I made it an effort to make sure that I have at least seen all the classic horror films. And my favorite book of all time now happens to be a horror novel. It's Stephen King's It. It's just so interesting how horror is such a big part of my life now in such a great way. And Neil Gaiman's work, while it does have horror elements in it, it's the whimsy and the fantasy and the darkness of said fantasies that I think could lure me in. So even though I did read that one Lock and Key Sandman crossover, I think Andy said it best when I talked about it with him. He said, "Steve, I don't think that was the right one for you to get into this. You got to read something else."
Somewhere else. And I'll have to Google it, but I don't think I made this up. I think Stephen King did an introductory letter for one of the volumes of Sandman. I should Google that and not speak out of turn. But if you have that kind of horror background more than you realize, Steve, especially saying It, there's something for you in Sandman.
I would agree with that. So before we wrap this up, I do want to go around the room and just ask everybody to give their final thoughts and a recommendation. April, you already have given some recommendations in regards to starting Neil Gaiman, but maybe there's something that people who may have actually read and appreciated Neil Gaiman haven't read. Clearly, you have given Andy a couple of things to read. You've definitely given me some suggestions. Is there something that you have not mentioned of Neil Gaiman's work that you think people should be looking for?
I don't think so. I think that the two big ones that I really want to get out into the world are Mirror Mask and The Sleeper and the Spindle, because those two things are the biggest Neil Gaiman parts of my heart that I love. But otherwise, if you haven't watched Doctor Who, you should always watch Doctor Who.
Yeah, I am one of those people that has not watched Doctor Who, and I've had this conversation with many, many people. I am definitely a true geek slash nerd slash whatever, but many, many years ago, I drew a line in the proverbial sand, and I'm like, I'm on this side of the line, and here's all the stuff that are on this side with me that I'm enjoying. On the other side of that line, there's Doctor Who, there's Dungeons and Dragons, there's Warhammer 40,000, there's Magic the Gathering, there's Munchkin, there's all these things that I know are wonderful. And I want to say that I don't have any hatred toward them. They are wonderful. But I just don't want to cross that line because I have so much already. And right now, based on, that's probably one of the main reasons why I am terrified to buy manga or download an app, because Andy's seen my comic book collection. Andy has seen my Funko Pop collection. I will literally be like in a box outside on a street, bathing myself in rainwater if I go any further. That's all I'm going to say. And today's a perfect day for that. At least on our side of the country. But anyway, Andy, how about yourself?
Yeah, I think talking about a recommendation, I'll go to something we didn't touch on, which is I suspect if one were to ask Neil Gaiman, he might think most highly of his short stories. There are many short story collections of his. My first and still my favorite is Fragile Things. I would really recommend people pick that up. And for a specific story in there, to kind of tie this back to the thesis of the channel, A Study in Emerald is a fantastic short story. And there is now a graphic novel version of it, which is absolutely fantastic. And I highly recommend it because when you read it, it really jumps off the page. And it's one of the ones that I felt was really screaming for something like that. So while it's not going to be a TV series, I don't think it would work as a film. I think something about the medium of comic really let it come to life. So Neil Gaiman short stories broadly is my recommendation. And for this channel, I'd really like people to consider picking up A Study in Emerald.
Okay, for my recommendation is definitely going to be something that I didn't even talk about at all. We didn't mention a very specific Neil Gaiman creation, and that is Death. And the one thing that I must recommend, don't get the movie Wonder Woman Bloodlines, the animated movie. It is terrible, but I would highly recommend to pick up the interactive movie of DC Showcase, Death in the Family, because there are some showcase shorts on there, and one of them is a DC animated showcase short of Death. And I will say, as someone who has been a Bruce Timm fan ever since he first sat and watched Batman the Animated Series, this is without a doubt the most brilliant thing that DC Animation has ever produced. It is one of the darkest things that I think DC Animation has ever given us. Right next to that is Constantine Cities of Demons. But the difference between that and this short Death is it is beautiful. It is filled to the brim with emotions. It is so deep, and there are some points in that dark story that are filled with so much light and so much beauty and so much hope. Grown men cry when they watch this. I know that I saw a tear in my eye once or twice, and Andy actually watched it with me because I said to him, Andy, you have to see this. Mm-hmm. And April, if you haven't seen it yet, you must, because it is, as a Neil Gaiman fan, I think that you would appreciate it. And also, the animation is breathtaking. Andy, if you want to say a couple things about it, go right for it.
No, all I'm going to say is watch that.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah, Cammie and I also talked about it in one of our DC animated live shows, and she also talked about how much she loved it too. It's beautiful. It is absolutely beautiful, and that is one of the main reasons why Neil Gaiman is one of the best out there right now in regards to comic books and film adaptations and stuff. I have a strange feeling that, in the vein of our discussion that we had a couple of months ago, Andy, with Cammie, when we discussed Zack Snyder's Justice League, I think I smell a Mirror Mask discussion in the wings one day. And I think we should do that because it is a Neil Gaiman story. Neil Gaiman is in the comic book realm. So maybe we could either do a discussion on the movie itself, or we could do a book to film comparison, which means I'll finally go out and read the source material. But that's all that we pretty much have for today. This is an excellent first episode of Creators Notes. I am looking forward to the next time that we have another one of these discussions, because there are so many amazing artists in comic books and manga that need to be discussed, because you may have heard those names, but you really need to crack open some of their work, because I'm seriously saying right now, as someone who has not read much of his written work, I will still say that Neil Gaiman is truly one of the best around. And with the two people here who know Neil Gaiman better than I do, I'm pretty sure that they are proud that I said that. But in the meantime, everybody, thank you all for watching, and we will see you in the next one.